That was a sort of magical time in my life doing that. I mean, it's like a dream when you're there. It's those incredible beaches, that incredible life.
A man steps off a plane into blinding sunlight, sweating through a suit that was never designed for this climate, and within a year, he'll be gone. That's not a spoiler. That's the deal. Every single lead detective who has ever worn the badge on Death in Paradise has eventually walked away from St. Marie, and audiences keep tuning in anyway, season after season, as if the departures themselves have become part of the appeal. On paper, this should have killed the show. Television dramas live and die by their leads. Audiences fall in love with a face, a voice, a rhythm of speech, and when that actor leaves, ratings usually follow them out the door. Yet Death in Paradise has done the opposite. It has built 15 years of success by continually replacing the one character every other detective series treats as sacred. To understand why this works, you have to start with Richard Poole, played by Ben Miller, the man who arguably invented the entire template. Richard hated the island. He hated the heat, the sand, the lack of formality, the fact that nothing on St. Marie behaved the way London did. He wore a full suit in tropical humidity as a kind of quiet protest against paradise itself. But underneath that stiffness was a mind capable of extraordinary precision, a detective who could walk into chaos and see the one detail everyone else had missed. Miller's performance made Richard prickly and awkward rather than charming, and that mattered, because it meant his slow thaw over 2 series felt earned rather than convenient. Fans watched him begin to trust his team, begin to understand Camille, begin to see the island as something more than an inconvenience. Then, in the opening episode of Series 3, the show did something almost unthinkable for a cozy Sunday night mystery. It killed him. Richard Poole was murdered, and the detective who had spent 2 years explaining everyone else's death became the victim of his own. That decision has been discussed for years by fans and critics alike, and it deserves to be understood as a structural choice rather than a shock tactic. Killing Richard solved an impossible writing problem. You cannot have a man who despised Paradise suddenly announce that he loves it and quietly go home. The emotional math doesn't add up. So the show chose finality instead, and in doing so, it proved something the format needed everyone to believe. No detective on St. Marie is untouchable, and the island itself, not the man solving the crimes, is the true center of the story. That single choice opened the door for Humphrey Goodman, played by Chris Marshall, who arrived carrying the hardest assignment in the show's history, winning over an audience that was still mourning his predecessor. The writers were smart enough not to repeat Richard. Where Richard was rigid and closed off, Humphrey was warm, clumsy, and emotionally transparent, a man who might apologize to a corpse before piecing together the case that solved it. Marshall brought genuine tenderness to the role, and Humphrey's arc became less about surviving Paradise and more about rebuilding a life that had come apart back home. His marriage was failing when he arrived, and St. Marie slowly gave him back a version of himself he thought he'd lost. When he eventually left, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like graduation. And years later, that idea was validated in the most unexpected way possible, when Humphrey returned as the lead of Beyond Paradise, a spin-off set entirely in England. That spin-off proved something crucial. A detective could leave St. Marie and keep the audience's loyalty, because his story didn't end when the plane took off. It simply moved. Then came Jack Mooney, played by Ardal O'Hanlon, a detective whose warmth masked a much quieter kind of pain. Jack was a widower, and he didn't come to the island chasing adventure. He came to it carrying grief he hadn't figured out how to put down. St. Marie gave him distraction, community, and space to breathe, and O'Hanlon, known to many audiences from his comedic work on Father Ted, brought a gentleness to the role that never tipped into silliness. Jack solved cases by listening, by letting suspects underestimate him, by circling a conversation until the truth had nowhere left to hide. His departure is often the most overlooked of the show's exits, but it might be the most quietly important. Jack didn't leave because the island beat him. He left because he had healed enough to realize that healing isn't the same as hiding, and that grief, however gently it's held, still needs to be carried back into a real life eventually. Ralph Little's Neville Parker arrived at what may have been the show's most vulnerable moment, stepping into a role that had already been recast twice. Fans knew the pattern by then, which made Neville's job even harder. He had to be new enough to justify existing and familiar enough not to break what already worked. Neville solved that problem by being almost comically unsuited to island life, allergic to seemingly everything, terrified of insects, uncertainty, and social risk in equal measure. But the show gave him something none of his predecessors had: time. Across many series, viewers watched him build real friendships, fall for Florence, make mistakes, get hurt, and slowly, believably, become braver without ever losing the anxious core of who he was. That's why his final exit, after Series 13, landed as something earned rather than convenient. Neville didn't leave because Saint Marie defeated him. He left because the island had finally taught him how to choose for himself, and walking away with Florence was, in its own way, the boldest thing he'd ever done. Now the show is in the hands of Don Gillet's Mervyn Wilson, a detective who arrives carrying something different from every predecessor. Not stiffness, not chaos, not grief in the same shape, but guardedness, a resistance to being softened by a place that seems determined to soften everyone who lands there. By this point, Death in Paradise has become self-aware about its own machinery, and that's precisely the challenge Mervyn faces. The first replacement was dramatic. The second proved the concept could survive. The third refreshed the tone. The fourth became a long emotional investment. By the fifth, audiences can see the gears turning, and yet the show keeps finding new angles because the format was never really about the detective at all. That's the deeper truth underneath all of this. Saint Marie is the actual main character. The detective is only ever a visitor. The police station, Catherine's bar, the beach house, Commissioner Selwyn Patterson's steady authority. These are the elements audiences return to, week after week, long after they've stopped expecting any particular detective to stay. Don Warrington Selwyn has watched every single one of them arrive and leave, which makes him the show's quiet institutional memory, the proof that Saint Marie isn't just scenery but a living community that continues whether or not this week's lead sticks around. When a series like Morse or Poirot ends, the entire world of the show ends with it. When a Death in Paradise detective leaves, the island simply waits for the next confused officer to step off the plane, sweating in a suit that never quite fits. And that points to the real reason every detective keeps leaving. It isn't only about actors wanting to go home to their families, though that's part of it. Ben Miller's departure was shaped by personal circumstances. Chris Marshall has spoken about missing his children during long stretches filming in Guadeloupe, and Ardal O'Hanlon has said simply that it felt like time to move on. The deeper reason is structural. Death in Paradise runs on discomfort. A detective arrives flawed, uncomfortable, and out of place, and that friction is what generates the comedy, the character growth, and the emotional stakes underneath every murder plot. Once a detective becomes too settled, too at ease, the premise that makes the show work starts to erode. He has to change to stay interesting, but if he changes too much, he no longer fits the fish-out-of-water shape the format depends on. So he has to leave, not because the writers are careless with beloved characters, but because staying too long would eventually break the very thing that made him compelling in the first place. It's worth remembering, too, that the detectives aren't the only ones who've said goodbye to Saint Marie. Camille left for a new chapter in Paris. Dwayne, Fidel, JP, Florence, and others have all come and gone in their own ways, some for new opportunities, some for family, some returning briefly to remind viewers that the island remembers everyone who's ever walked through it. That constant, careful rotation is what keeps Saint Marie from feeling frozen without ever making the audience feel abandoned. There's always someone left standing in the police station doorway who's seen it all before. So why does every detective keep leaving the island? Because Death in Paradise is built on a contradiction that somehow keeps working instead of collapsing. The audience wants Saint Marie to stay exactly the same, while the format needs its lead to keep changing. A detective arrives uncertain, wounded, or afraid. The island slowly reshapes him. The team softens him. The cases, one by one, reveal exactly what he's been avoiding. And then, just as he becomes whole enough to finally belong, the story has to let him go, because Paradise was never meant to be a place anyone stays forever. It was always meant to be a turning point, a place people pass through on their way to becoming someone slightly braver, slightly softer, slightly more themselves than when they arrived. Richard answered that question with resistance and was frozen there in memory. Humphrey answered it by following love home. Jack answered it by realizing grief needed more room than an island could give it. Neville answered it by choosing courage over comfort. And Mervyn right now is still writing his answer, one case at a time, under the same relentless Caribbean sun that has tested every officer who came before him.